The winter wind howled through Red River, New Mexico, with such ferocity that it seemed determined to strip the flesh from bone. And Caroline Bennett stumbled through the snow-covered Main Street with vision blurring at the edges, her empty stomach cramping so violently she could barely stand upright. The year was 1882, and she had been traveling for 3 weeks with nothing but determination and the clothes on her back, fleeing from a life that had promised her nothing but misery. Her father had died 6 months prior, leaving debts that men with hard eyes and harder fists had come to collect. And when they suggested she could work off what was owed in ways that made her skin crawl, Caroline had taken what little she could carry and disappeared into the night. Red River was supposed to be her salvation, a mining town where her mother's distant cousin ran a boarding house and might take pity on a desperate young woman. But Caroline had miscalculated the journey, underestimated the harshness of a New Mexico winter in the mountains, and her meager supplies had run out 2 days ago. She was 21 years old and felt ancient, every step a monumental effort as the world tilted sideways. The buildings around her seemed to waver like mirages, their wooden facades bleeding into the white landscape. She thought she heard voices, the sound of horses, but everything was muffled beneath the roar of wind and the thundering of her own heartbeat in her ears. Her knees buckled and she tried to catch herself, but her body had simply given up. The ground rushed up to meet her, and the last thing Caroline saw before darkness claimed her was a pair of boots, well-worn leather covered in trail dust, stopping just inches from her face. Yates Harlow had been about to enter the general store when he saw her fall. His instincts, honed by years of working cattle drives and surviving in harsh conditions, kicked in immediately. He was off his horse and kneeling beside her before the thought fully formed, his gloved hands gentle as he turned her over. She was light as a child, her face pale as death beneath the grime of hard travel, lips tinged blue from the cold. He pressed his fingers to her throat and felt the flutter of a pulse, weak but steady. "Someone get Doc Brennan," he shouted, but the street was nearly empty, everyone sensible enough to be indoors on a day like this. Yates made a split-second decision and gathered the unconscious woman into his arms, carrying her toward his small house at the edge of town. He had rented it just a month ago after taking a job as foreman at the Double R Ranch, tired of bunkhouse living at 26 and wanting a place to call his own. The wind fought him every step, but Yates was a tall man, strong from years of physical labor, and he held her close to his chest to shield her from the worst of it. His dark hair whipped around his face, and ice crystals stung his cheeks, but he kept moving. When he finally shouldered through his front door, the warmth from the pot-bellied stove hit him like a wall. He laid her carefully on his bed, the only bed in the small house, and quickly began removing her wet outer layers. Her coat was threadbare, more holes than fabric, and her dress beneath was damp with melted snow. Yates worked with clinical efficiency, his mind focused solely on warming her before hypothermia set in. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, tucking them around her shivering form, and built up the fire until it roared. Only then did he really look at her. She was young, probably early 20s, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and spread across his pillow in tangled waves. Her face was thin, too thin, with hollows beneath her cheekbones that spoke of prolonged hunger. Dirt smudged her forehead and jaw, and her hands when he checked them were rough and chapped, the nails broken. Yates went to his small kitchen area and pulled out the pot of soup he had made that morning, thick with beef and vegetables from the ranch. He added wood to the stove and heated it slowly, then poured a portion into a bowl. When he returned to her side, she was beginning to stir, small sounds of distress escaping her throat. "Easy now," he said softly, settling onto the edge of the bed. "You are safe." Caroline's eyes fluttered open, and panic immediately flooded through her. She did not recognize the room, the man, anything. She tried to sit up, but her body would not cooperate, muscles weak and unresponsive. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a rasp, her throat dry and aching. "My home," Yates replied, keeping his tone calm and reassuring. "You fainted in the street. I brought you here to get you warm. My name is Yates Harlow." She searched his face, looking for danger, but found only concern in his gray eyes. He had an honest face, weathered from sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days' stubble. There was kindness in the set of his mouth, the way he held himself at a respectful distance despite sitting on the bed. "I do not have any money," Caroline whispered, shame coloring her cheeks. "I cannot pay you for help." "I am not asking for payment," Yates said firmly. "When did you last eat?" The question brought tears to her eyes, and she turned her face away. "2 days, maybe 3. I lost track." Yates felt anger kindle in his chest, not at her but at whatever circumstances had brought a young woman to such a desperate state. He had seen hard times himself, knew what it was to go hungry, and the memory made him even more determined to help her. "I have soup," he said. "Will you let me help you eat?" Caroline wanted to refuse, wanted to claim she could manage on her own, but the smell of the food made her stomach clench with such violent need that she could only nod. Yates propped her up carefully, arranging pillows behind her back, and brought the spoon to her lips. The first taste of warm broth on her tongue was almost painful in its intensity. She made a small sound, something between a sob and a moan, and Yates paused. "Too hot?" he asked. "No," she managed. "It is perfect. I just forgot what food tasted like." He fed her slowly, small spoonfuls that would not overwhelm her shrunken stomach, and between each bite, he waited patiently. Caroline watched him as she ate, this stranger who had carried her to safety and was now tending to her with the gentleness of a nurse. His hands were large and calloused but steady, and he never rushed her, never showed impatience. "What is your name?" Yates asked when she had finished half the bowl. "Caroline Bennett," she said, her voice stronger now. "I was trying to reach my mother's cousin. She runs a boarding house here, or at least she did. Mrs. Sarah Whitmore." Yates frowned slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore passed on last winter, I am afraid. Influenza took her and a dozen others." The news should have devastated Caroline, but she was too exhausted to feel anything but a dull resignation. Of course her one hope would be gone. It seemed fitting with how the rest of her life had unfolded. "I see," she said quietly. "Where did you travel from?" Yates asked, offering her another spoonful of soup. "Kansas. A town called Millbrook near the Missouri border." She took the soup, swallowed, and continued. "My father died and left debts. The men he owed came for payment, and when I could not give it, they offered me other ways to settle accounts. I left that very night." Yates's jaw tightened. He could well imagine what kind of payment those men had demanded. "You did the right thing leaving." "Did I?" Caroline laughed, a bitter sound. "I nearly died in the snow." "But you did not," Yates pointed out. "You made it here. That takes strength." She met his eyes and saw no pity there, only respect, and something in her chest loosened. For the first time in months, she felt like she might survive this. Yates finished feeding her the soup, then brought her water to drink. By the time she had drained the cup, her eyelids were drooping again, exhaustion pulling her under. "Sleep," Yates said, standing and pulling the blankets higher around her shoulders. "Rest as long as you need." "Where will you sleep?" Caroline asked, suddenly aware that she was in his bed and he had nowhere else. "I have a chair and a fire," Yates replied with a slight smile. I have slept in far worse conditions, trust me." She wanted to protest, but sleep was already claiming her, and the last thing she felt was the gentle weight of his hand smoothing the hair back from her forehead, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. Caroline slept through the rest of that day and into the night, her body finally given permission to rest. Yates checked on her every hour, making sure she was still breathing, still warm. He dozed in his chair when he could, but mostly he watched her and wondered about her story, about what kind of courage it took to walk away from everything familiar and strike out alone. When dawn broke, pale and cold, Caroline woke to find Yates asleep in the chair by the fire, his head tipped back against the wood, one hand resting on his chest. She studied him in the gray morning light, taking in details she had been too weak to notice before. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and the kind of build that came from hard physical work. There was a scar along his jawline, faded with age, and his hands, even in sleep, looked capable. She sat up slowly, testing her strength, and found she could manage it without the room spinning. Her stomach no longer cramped with hunger, though she felt hollowed out, fragile as glass. She needed to use the privy, and the thought of asking this man for help with that particular need made her flush with embarrassment. As if sensing her distress, Yates stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment, he looked confused, then memory clearly returned and he sat up straighter. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Better," Caroline admitted, "but I need to use the facilities." Understanding crossed his face and he stood quickly. "The outhouse is just behind the building. Can you walk or should I help you?" "I can walk," Caroline said, though she was not entirely sure that was true. Pride, however, demanded she try. Yates helped her stand, keeping a respectful hand at her elbow, and walked her to the back door. The cold air was a shock after the warmth of the house, but it also cleared her head. The outhouse was blessedly close, and Caroline made it there and back on her own, though by the time she returned to the warmth, she was shaking. Yates guided her back to the bed and brought her more water. "I will make breakfast," he said. "Do you think you can eat?" "I will try," Caroline replied. The thought of food still made her slightly queasy, but she knew she needed to eat to regain her strength. She watched as Yates moved around the small kitchen with easy familiarity, frying eggs and salt pork, making coffee that smelled like heaven. He brought her a plate with small portions and sat in the chair beside the bed while she ate slowly and carefully. "What will you do now?" Yates asked after a while. "Do you have anywhere else to go?" Caroline shook her head. "No family left that I know of, no friends who could help. I had hoped Mrs. Whitmore would let me work for room and board, but now—" She trailed off, staring down at her plate. "There is work in Red River," Yates said carefully. "The town is growing with the mining operations. Mrs. Patterson, who runs the restaurant, is always looking for help. The laundry takes on workers. It is not easy work, but it is honest." "I am not afraid of hard work," Caroline said, lifting her chin. "I worked in my father's dry goods store from the time I was old enough to count change. I can sew, cook, clean, keep accounts. I will find something." Yates nodded, respecting her determination. "Until you are stronger, you are welcome to stay here. I work long hours at the ranch, so you would have the place mostly to yourself during the day." Caroline looked at him sharply. "Why are you helping me? You do not know me." "I could be a thief or worse." "Are you?" Yates asked, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "No," Caroline said firmly, "but you have no way of knowing that." "I am a fair judge of character," Yates replied, "and I know what it is to need help and not have anywhere to turn. When I was 17, I left home after my parents died of cholera. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a horse that was more bone than flesh. A rancher in Texas took me in, taught me the trade, gave me a chance. I figure I owe the world a kindness or two in return." His honesty disarmed her, and Caroline felt something shift inside her, a tiny spark of hope she had thought long extinguished. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will repay you somehow." "Get well," Yates said. "That is payment enough." Over the next few days, a routine developed between them. Yates would rise before dawn and leave for the ranch, but not before making sure Caroline had food and water within reach. He would return in the evening, often after dark, and they would share a simple meal while talking. Caroline learned that he had worked ranches all across Texas and New Mexico, that he loved horses, and had a gift for gentling even the wildest Mustang. He spoke of the land with a reverence that surprised her, describing sunsets over the plains and the way the mountains looked when snow first touched their peaks. In turn, Caroline shared pieces of her own story. She told him about growing up in Kansas, about her mother who had died when Caroline was 15, about her father who had been a good man but a poor businessman. She did not speak much about the men who had driven her away, but Yates could read between the lines, and his hands would clench into fists when she glossed over certain details. On the fourth day, Caroline insisted on getting out of bed properly. She was still weak, but the constant rest and regular meals had begun to restore her strength. Yates had washed her clothes, a fact that made her blush furiously when she realized it, and she dressed in the small partitioned area he had rigged for her privacy. When she emerged, Yates looked up from where he was mending a bridle and smiled. "It is good to see you on your feet." "It is good to be on my feet," Caroline admitted. She looked around the small house, really seeing it for the first time. It was sparse but clean, with a few personal touches that spoke of Yates's character: a well-worn Bible on the shelf, a photograph of an older couple she assumed were his parents, a harmonica resting on the windowsill. "May I make myself useful?" Caroline asked. "I feel like a burden just lying about." "You are not a burden," Yates said immediately, but he saw the determination in her eyes and relented. "There is mending if you are interested. I am terrible with a needle." Caroline smiled, a real smile that transformed her face, and Yates felt his heart do something strange in his chest. She was beautiful when she smiled, he realized, with a warmth that lit her green eyes from within. She settled into the chair by the fire and picked up his sewing basket, such as it was, a tin box with needles and thread in various states of disarray. As she sorted through it, organizing with practiced efficiency, Yates went back to his bridle, but he found himself watching her more than working. "You are staring," Caroline said without looking up, though there was amusement in her tone. "Sorry," Yates muttered, feeling heat creep up his neck. "I am not used to having company." "I imagine not, given the state of these socks," Caroline said, holding up a pair that had more holes than fabric. "When did you last darn anything?" "Never," Yates admitted. "I usually just throw them out and buy new ones when I can afford it." Caroline shook her head, but she was smiling. "What a waste. I can salvage these." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the wind howling outside but unable to touch the warmth they had created inside. Yates found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did, the constant vigilance he maintained in the outside world easing in Caroline's presence. "Tell me about the ranch," Caroline said after a while. "What is it like?" Yates set aside the bridle and leaned back. "The Double R is one of the largest operations in this part of New Mexico. We run about 2,000 head of cattle, mostly Herefords. The owner, Mr. Richardson, is a fair man, pays decent wages and does not work his men to death. The land is beautiful, high desert with mountains in the distance. In spring, the wildflowers bloom so thick you cannot see the ground." "You love it," Caroline observed. "I do," Yates agreed. There is something about working with animals, being out in the open air, that suits me. I could never be cooped up in an office or a shop. And yet you came inside at the end of each day to take care of me, Caroline said softly. That is different, Yates replied, meeting her eyes. That is not being cooped up. That is coming home. The weight of those words hung between them, and Caroline felt her pulse quicken. There was something building here, something neither of them had named yet, but it was growing stronger each day. Before either could speak again, a knock at the door broke the moment. Yates rose and opened it to find his boss, Thomas Richardson, standing on the step, snow dusting his broad shoulders. "Yates," Richardson said with a nod. "Did not see you at the bunkhouse tonight for cards. Wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything is fine, sir," Yates replied. "I have been tending to a guest. Come in out of the cold." Richardson entered, removing his hat, and stopped short when he saw Caroline. She had stood when he entered, a polite reflex, and was watching him with wary eyes. "This is Miss Caroline Bennett," Yates introduced. "She arrived in town about a week ago and took ill. Caroline, this is Mr. Thomas Richardson, owner of the Double R." "Pleased to meet you, sir," Caroline said, inclining her head. Richardson was a man in his 50s, with silver threading his dark hair and keen blue eyes that missed nothing. He took in the scene, the mending in Caroline's hands, the domestic comfort of the small house, the way Yates positioned himself slightly between them as if to protect her. "Miss Bennett," Richardson said politely, "I hope you are feeling better." "Much better, thank you," Caroline replied. "Mr. Harlow has been very kind." "That sounds like him," Richardson said, a slight smile tugging at his mouth. He turned to Yates. "I actually came to talk business. We have a situation with the north pasture fence, and I want your opinion. Can you ride out tomorrow morning early?" "Of course," Yates said immediately. "Good man." Richardson nodded to Caroline again. "Miss Bennett, a pleasure to meet you." After he left, Caroline sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly shaky. "He thinks I am your mistress," she said, mortified. "He thinks no such thing," Yates countered, but his ears were red. "And even if he did, it is none of his concern." "It is your reputation," Caroline argued. "I should find somewhere else to stay." "Where?" Yates challenged. "The boarding house is full and the hotel costs more than you have." "You said yourself you have no money." Caroline bit her lip, frustrated because he was right. "I will find work. I can start tomorrow." "You are still recovering," Yates protested. "I am well enough to ask around," Caroline insisted. "I will not be a burden any longer than necessary." Yates wanted to argue that she was not a burden, that he liked having her here, that the thought of her leaving made his chest tight. But he could see the determination in her face and knew pushing would only make her dig in harder. "We will go together tomorrow," he said finally. "After I return from the ranch. I can introduce you to Mrs. Patterson and some others who might have work." Caroline nodded, relief and anxiety warring in her expression. She wanted independence, needed it to feel like herself again, but the thought of leaving this warm house and the safety Yates represented frightened her more than she wanted to admit. That night, Caroline lay in the bed that still smelled faintly of Yates' leather and wood smoke, and something uniquely him, and stared at the ceiling. She could hear him breathing in the chair by the fire, a steady rhythm that was becoming as familiar as her own heartbeat. In just a week, this man had become essential to her in ways she did not fully understand. She thought about the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, a hunger in his eyes that had nothing to do with food. She thought about the careful way he never touched her unless necessary, respecting her space even though she slept in his bed. She thought about his kindness, his quiet strength, the way he made her feel safe for the first time in months. Caroline had never been in love. There had been a boy back in Kansas, a farmer's son who had courted her briefly, but her father had discouraged it, and the boy had lost interest when someone with a larger dowry came along. She had thought herself destined for spinsterhood, especially after her father's death, when survival became more important than romance. But now, lying in the dark with the wind howling outside, Caroline wondered if what she felt for Yates Harlow might be the beginning of something deeper. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The next day dawned clear and bitterly cold. Yates left before sunrise, promising to return by early afternoon. Caroline used the time to thoroughly clean the small house, needing to feel useful, to give something back for all Yates had done. She swept and scrubbed, organized his meager pantry, and even tackled the pile of mending she had started the day before. When Yates returned, he stopped in the doorway and stared. The house gleamed, every surface clean, and something savory bubbled in the pot on the stove. Caroline stood by the window, folding the last of his mended shirts, and she turned when she heard him enter. "What is all this?" Yates asked, wonder in his voice. "Payment," Caroline said simply. "I told you I would not be a burden." Yates crossed to her, and before she could react, he took her hands in his. They were red and chapped from the cleaning water, and he rubbed his thumbs gently over her knuckles. "You did not have to do this," he said softly. "I wanted to," Caroline replied, very aware of the warmth of his hands, the calluses on his palms, the way he was looking at her like she was something precious. For a long moment they stood like that, hands joined, something electric passing between them. Then Yates cleared his throat and stepped back, though he seemed reluctant to let her go. "Are you still determined to find work today?" he asked. "I am," Caroline said, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. "The sooner I can support myself, the better." They walked to town together, Yates matching his long stride to her shorter one. The main street of Red River was bustling despite the cold, miners and cowboys and families going about their business. Caroline drew a few curious looks, and she was acutely aware of how shabby her appearance must be. Her dress patched and worn, her coat barely adequate. Yates led her to a restaurant with a hand-painted sign that read, "Patterson's Kitchen." Inside, warmth and the smell of baking bread enveloped them. A woman in her 40s, stout and formidable, looked up from where she was wiping down tables. "Yates Harlow," she said, her stern expression softening. "What brings you here in the middle of the day, Mrs. Patterson? I wanted to introduce you to Miss Caroline Bennett," Yates said. "She is new to town and looking for work. I thought you might have a position available." Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes assessed Caroline from head to toe, missing nothing. "Can you cook?" "Yes, madam," Caroline replied. "I can also wait tables, clean, and keep accounts if needed." "Show me your hands," Mrs. Patterson demanded. Caroline held them out, and the older woman examined them with the thoroughness of a horse trader checking teeth. "You have done hard work," Mrs. Patterson said. "That is good. I have no patience for soft city girls who think serving food is beneath them." She paused, considering. "I can offer you room and board plus $3 a week. You would work 6 days, morning to evening, with Wednesday afternoons off. The room is small, barely bigger than a closet, but it is clean and warm." Interested. $3 a week was not much, but it was honest work and a place to stay. Caroline felt Yates tense beside her and knew he wanted her to refuse to come back to his house, but she also knew this was the right choice. "I am very interested," Caroline said firmly. "When can I start?" "Tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock sharp," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Do not be late." "I will not be, madam. Thank you." They left the restaurant, and Yates was quiet as they walked back toward his house. Caroline could feel the tension radiating from him and finally stopped in the middle of the street. "What is wrong?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "Nothing is wrong," Yates said, but he would not meet her eyes. "You got a job. That is what you wanted." "But it is not what you wanted," Caroline said softly. Yates finally looked at her, and the emotion in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "I know I have no right to ask you to stay. We have known each other barely more than a week. But the thought of you leaving, of not seeing you every day, it feels wrong somehow." Caroline's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Yates, I cannot stay with you without work, without a way to support myself. It would not be proper, and more than that, I need to prove to myself that I can survive on my own." "I understand that," Yates said. "I do, but it does not make it easier." They stood there in the street, people moving around them, and Caroline made a decision that was either very brave or very foolish. "I start work tomorrow," she said. "But I have the rest of today and tonight. Will you show me around Red River? I should know the town if I am going to live here." Yates's face lit up, and he offered her his arm. "It would be my pleasure, Miss Bennett." They spent the afternoon exploring the town. Yates showed her the general store, the blacksmith, the church with its white steeple, and the small schoolhouse where a teacher from Boston struggled to educate the miners' children. They walked past the saloons and gambling halls that Yates pointedly did not suggest they enter, and down to the creek that gave the town its name, frozen now but beautiful in its stillness. Caroline asked questions about everything, hungry for knowledge about this place that would be her new home. Yates answered patiently, pointing out which businesses were honest and which to avoid, which families were friendly and which kept to themselves. He introduced her to the shopkeepers and the minister, each time with a pride in his voice that made Caroline's chest feel tight. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they found themselves at the edge of town, looking out over the valley below. The wind had died down, and in the stillness the only sound was the crunch of snow under their feet. "It is beautiful here," Caroline said softly. "Hard but beautiful." "Like you," Yates said, then looked startled as if the words had escaped without permission. Caroline turned to face him, her cheeks pink from more than just the cold. "Yates, I know I should not say such things," Yates interrupted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know we barely know each other, and you have every reason to be cautious of men after what you have been through. But I cannot let you leave tomorrow without telling you how I feel. From the moment I saw you fall in the street, something in me recognized something in you. This week, having you in my home, talking with you, learning who you are, it has been the best week of my life. I am not a rich man, Caroline. I have this job and a little saved, but not much else. But if you would consider, if you might feel even a fraction of what I feel, I would count myself the luckiest man alive." Caroline stared at him, her eyes wide, and for a terrible moment Yates thought he had ruined everything. Then she stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "I feel it too," she whispered. "It frightens me how much I feel it. I thought I was alone in the world, that I would have to be hard and cold to survive. But you showed me kindness when you had no reason to, and you have been nothing but gentle and good. I do not know if what I feel is love, not yet, but I think it could become love very easily." Yates covered her hand with his own, holding it against his heart. "Then we have time to find out. You will be at the restaurant and I will be at the ranch, but Red River is not so large that we cannot see each other. I can come for meals, and on your Wednesday afternoons off, we could spend time together. If you want to." "I want to," Caroline said, and she rose on her tiptoes, emboldened by his confession and her own feelings. She pressed a soft kiss to his cheek, feeling the scratch of stubble against her lips, breathing in the scent of him. Yates went very still. Then slowly, carefully, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her properly, his lips warm and gentle against hers. It was a tentative kiss, full of question and promise, and when they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Caroline," Yates said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," she replied, resting her forehead against his. "I know." They walked back to his house hand in hand, neither speaking, both lost in thought. That night, their last night together before Caroline started her new life, they sat by the fire and talked until late, sharing stories and dreams, building the foundation of something that felt inevitable. When Caroline finally went to bed, Yates pressed a kiss to her forehead and whispered, "Sleep well. I will see you tomorrow." But Caroline could not sleep, her mind too full of possibility and hope. She had come to Red River expecting nothing but perhaps a chance at survival, and instead, she had found something that felt like a future. The next morning, Yates walked Caroline to the restaurant before dawn, carrying the small bundle of her possessions. Mrs. Patterson met them at the door, her expression softening slightly when she saw their joined hands. "Say your goodbyes," she said gruffly. "Then get inside, girl. We have breakfast to prepare." Yates pulled Caroline aside out of Mrs. Patterson's direct line of sight. "I will come for lunch today," he promised, "and dinner, and probably breakfast tomorrow." Caroline laughed, the sound like music in the pre-dawn stillness. "You will go broke buying meals." "Worth it," Yates replied, kissing her quickly. "Go on now, show her what you can do." Caroline squeezed his hand once more, then turned and walked into the restaurant, not looking back because she knew if she did, she might not have the strength to stay. The work was hard, harder than anything Caroline had done before. Mrs. Patterson ran her kitchen with military precision, and she expected perfection from everyone who worked for her. Caroline spent that first day chopping vegetables until her hands cramped, scrubbing pots until her arms ached, and serving customers with a smile even when her feet screamed in protest. But true to his word, Yates appeared at lunchtime, choosing a table in Caroline's section. His face lit up when he saw her, and she felt her exhaustion ease just from his presence. She brought him the daily special roast beef with potatoes and carrots, and he caught her hand briefly. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. "I will survive," Caroline replied with a tired smile. "Mrs. Patterson is tough but fair." "That she is," Yates agreed. "Everyone in town respects her." Over the next few weeks, a pattern developed. Yates came to the restaurant as often as he could, and on Wednesday afternoons, he and Caroline would walk together, exploring the surrounding countryside or simply sitting and talking. They learned each other slowly, carefully, building trust and affection in equal measure. Caroline discovered that Yates had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. He was unfailingly patient, never pushing her for more than she was ready to give, content to build their relationship at whatever pace she set. He told her about his dreams of one day owning his own ranch, a small spread where he could raise horses and maybe some cattle, living simply but honestly. In turn, Yates learned that Caroline had a sharp mind for numbers and a love of reading that had been frustrated by lack of access to books. He started bringing her volumes from his small collection, and later, borrowing from others in town to feed her appetite for stories. He discovered she sang while she worked, soft melodies that spoke of old country songs and church hymns. He learned that she was fiercely independent but desperately wanted to be part of something larger than herself, to have a home and family again. Winter slowly gave way to early spring, and with the thaw came change. Mrs. Patterson, impressed by Caroline's work ethic and skill, promoted her to head cook and raised her wages to $5 a week. It was a significant increase, and Caroline was so excited she threw her arms around Yates when she told him, not caring that they were in the middle of the street. "I am so proud of you," Yates said, spinning her around, her laughter ringing out clear and bright. I can start saving, Caroline said when he set her down. Really saving for the future. What kind of future are you saving for? Yates asked, his heart in his throat. Caroline met his eyes steadily. The kind with a house and a husband and maybe children someday. The kind I thought I would never have. Caroline, Yates breathed, understanding flooding through him. Are you saying? I am saying I love you, Yates Harlow, Caroline interrupted, her cheeks flushed but her voice firm. I have loved you for weeks now, maybe since you fed me that first bowl of soup and stayed by my side. I know we have not been courting long by most standards, but I know my own heart, and it is yours if you want it. Yates did not answer with words. Instead, he pulled her close and kissed her right there on Main Street, with half the town as witnesses. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, they heard applause and turned to see Mrs. Patterson standing in the doorway of her restaurant, clapping slowly. About time, the older woman called. Now get inside, Caroline. We have dinner service in 2 hours. But she was smiling, a rare and genuine smile, and Caroline knew she had Mrs. Patterson's blessing. That evening, after the restaurant closed, Yates waited outside for Caroline. When she emerged, tired but happy, he took her hand and led her back to his small house. They had been careful about propriety up until now, always meeting in public, always maintaining respectability. But tonight felt different. Inside, with the door closed against the world, Yates pulled Caroline into his arms and held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. I love you too, he said quietly. I have loved you since you smiled at me over that first bowl of soup, maybe even before that, when I saw your courage in making it as far as you did against all odds. You are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of you. Caroline pulled back just enough to look up at him. You already have, Yates. Every single day you prove it. They kissed again, slower this time, deeper, with the knowledge that they had all the time in the world. When they finally separated, both trembling slightly, Yates cleared his throat. I want to marry you, he said, properly with the minister and the whole town as witnesses. But I do not have much to offer yet. I have been saving, but it will be at least another year before I have enough for the down payment on land. I do not care about land, Caroline said firmly. I care about you. We can save together, build together, and when we are ready, we will have our ranch. You would marry me even without the ranch? Yates asked, needing to be sure. I would marry you if we had to live in a tent, Caroline replied, though I admit I prefer your house. Yates laughed, the sound full of relief and joy. Then I will talk to the minister tomorrow. Unless you want a long engagement. I have waited 21 years to find you, Caroline said. I do not want to wait any longer than necessary. They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright April morning when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom across the hills. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church with most of the town in attendance. Caroline wore a dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make from fabric Yates had bought, a soft blue that brought out the green in her eyes. Yates wore his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his face shining with happiness. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Yates kissed his bride, the church erupted in cheers. The celebration afterward was held at Patterson's kitchen, with Mrs. Patterson herself closing the restaurant for the day and providing the wedding feast. There was music and dancing, and more than one person commented that they had never seen Yates Harlow smile so much. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Yates and Caroline slipped away to the house that was now officially theirs together. Yates carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the middle of the room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Harlow," he said softly. "It sounds perfect," Caroline replied, reaching up to cup his face. "I never thought I would have a home again, and now I have one with you." That night, they consummated their marriage with tenderness and care, learning each other in new ways, building intimacy alongside the love they had already formed. In the morning, Caroline woke wrapped in Yates's arms, the winter wind that had nearly killed her months ago now just a distant memory. Life settled into a new rhythm. Caroline continued working at the restaurant, though now it was by choice rather than necessity, saving every penny she could. Yates worked long hours at the Double R, but he also started taking on extra jobs breaking horses, repairing fences, anything that would add to their savings. They were building toward a dream, and every dollar brought it closer. Mr. Richardson, impressed by Yates's dedication and skill, promoted him to ranch manager with a substantial raise in pay. The promotion came with increased responsibilities, but it also meant more money for their future. When Yates told Caroline the news, she cried with happiness, knowing they were one step closer to their goal. 2 years after their wedding, on a warm June day, Yates came home with news that had him practically vibrating with excitement. He found Caroline in their small garden, tending the vegetables they had planted, and swept her up into his arms. "There is land for sale," he said without preamble. 300 acres north of town with a creek running through it and good grazing. The owner is selling because he is moving back east, and he is asking a fair price. With what we have saved and what the bank will lend us, we can do it, Caroline. We can buy our ranch." Caroline's hands flew to her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. "Are you certain? Is it truly possible?" "It is more than possible," Yates said, setting her down but keeping his hands on her waist. "I have already spoken to the bank. With my salary and our savings, they are willing to extend us the credit. We could own land, Caroline, our own land." They rode out to see the property the next day, and Caroline fell in love with it immediately. The land rolled gently, covered in spring grass, with stands of pinon and juniper scattered across it. The creek Yates had mentioned sparkled in the sunlight, and in the distance the mountains rose up, purple and majestic against the blue sky. "It is perfect," Caroline breathed, standing on a small rise and looking out over what could be theirs. "There is no house yet," Yates warned. "We would have to build or live in town until we could afford to." "We will build," Caroline said decisively. "Nothing fancy at first, just something solid. We can expand as we need to." They bought the land, signing the papers with shaking hands, barely able to believe that they were landowners. The first year was brutally hard. They lived in a small cabin Yates built with the help of friends from the ranch, working their own land while Yates still maintained his job at the Double R. Caroline left the restaurant to focus on the ranch, raising chickens and a few pigs, starting a larger vegetable garden. They acquired their first cattle, 20 head that Yates bought from Mr. Richardson at a fair price, and slowly, painfully slowly, began to build their herd. There were setbacks. A hard winter that killed 3 calves, a dry summer that shrank the creek to a trickle, repairs that ate into their carefully hoarded savings. But there were triumphs too. The first successful roundup, the birth of healthy calves in the spring, the day they paid off their first bank loan. Through it all, Yates and Caroline worked side by side, their partnership deepening with every shared struggle and victory. On the hardest days, when everything seemed impossible, they would stand together looking out over their land and remember how far they had come from that snowy day when Caroline had collapsed in the street. 5 years into their marriage, Caroline discovered she was pregnant. The news came as both a joy and a terror. They had hoped for children, but feared the burden it would add to their already stretched resources. Yates, however, was unequivocally thrilled, treating Caroline like she was made of glass from the moment he learned. "I am pregnant, not dying," Caroline protested when he tried to prevent her from lifting anything heavier than a spoon. "I know," Yates said, but he continued to hover, and Caroline found she did not mind as much as she pretended to. Their son was born on a cold November night in 1887, with Mrs. Patterson acting as midwife. The labor was long and difficult, and Yates wore a path in the floorboards with his pacing, but when he finally heard his son's first cry, he burst into the bedroom to find Caroline exhausted but smiling, holding a red-faced, squalling infant. "Meet your son," Caroline said softly. Yates approached almost reverently, looking down at the tiny person they had created. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were gray like his father's. "He is perfect," Yates whispered. "You are perfect." What should we name him? They had discussed names for months, unable to agree, but now, looking at her son, Caroline knew. "James," she said. "After my father, James Harlow." "James," Yates repeated, testing the name. "I like it. James Harlow, welcome to the world." Parenthood changed them in ways both expected and surprising. Yates, already gentle by nature, became even more so, handling his son with such tender care that Caroline sometimes caught herself just watching them together, her heart full to bursting. Caroline discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, managing the demands of a newborn while still helping run the ranch. Mrs. Patterson, who had become like a mother to Caroline over the years, was a frequent visitor, bringing food and advice in equal measure. She became James's honorary grandmother, spoiling him shamelessly and glaring at anyone who suggested she was going soft. The ranch continued to grow. By the time James was 3, they had expanded to 100 head of cattle and were beginning to break even financially. Yates had left his job at the Double R to focus entirely on their own operation, a risk that had terrified them both but was proving worthwhile. They hired their first hand, a young man named Miguel who had worked with Yates at the Double R and jumped at the chance to join a growing operation. When James was 5, Caroline became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and she delivered a healthy daughter in the early spring of 1893. They named her Sarah, after Caroline's mother, and she had her mother's auburn hair and a temperament that promised to be as fiery as her coloring. Life fell into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. The ranch prospered, the children grew healthy and strong, and Yates and Caroline's love for each other only deepened with time. They built a proper house to replace the cabin, nothing grand but comfortable, with enough rooms for their growing family and even a few extra for guests. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Yates and Caroline would sit on their porch and watch the sunset, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. "You ever think about that winter?" Caroline asked one evening when James was 8 and Sarah was 3. "When I collapsed in the street." "Every day," Yates admitted. "I think about how close I came to never meeting you, never having this life. What if I had been 5 minutes later? What if someone else had found you first?" "But you did find me," Caroline said, tilting her head to look up at him. "And you stayed. Even when you had every reason not to, you stayed." "I could do nothing else," Yates replied. "From that first moment, you were mine to protect, to care for. I knew it in my bones." "I was so angry at first," Caroline confessed. "Angry at my circumstances, at my father for dying and leaving me alone, at the world for being so hard. But you showed me that hardship can lead to something beautiful, that the worst moments can be the doorway to the best ones." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable in each other's presence in the way only long married couples can be. The land around them was quiet, The cattle settled for the night, the mountains dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky. "I am thinking about expanding the herd again," Yates said eventually. "Miguel thinks we can handle another 50 head with the grazing we have." "What do you think?" Caroline asked, trusting his judgment. "I think he is right. We have had good rain this year and beef prices are strong. It is a risk, but a calculated one." "Then let us do it," Caroline decided. "We have never been afraid of risk." Yates kissed the top of her head. "We have each other. That is all the security I need." The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life, calving season, roundups, branding, the endless cycle of work that came with raising cattle. James grew tall and strong, learning the trade from his father, developing the same gentle way with animals and quiet competence. Sarah proved to have a head for numbers and started keeping the ranch books when she was barely 10. Her neat figures a far cry from Caroline's hurried scrawls. When James was 12, disaster struck in the form of a late spring blizzard that caught everyone by surprise. Yates and Miguel were out checking the herd when the storm hit, and they did not make it back before the snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets. Caroline stood at the window, James beside her, both watching the white wall that had swallowed the world. She tried not to remember another blizzard, another time when winter had nearly taken everything from her, but the memories pressed close. "He will be all right," James said, though his young voice wavered. "Father knows this land better than anyone." "I know," Caroline replied, but her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles showed white. They waded through that day and into the night, keeping the fire burning bright as a beacon. Sarah, too young to fully understand the danger, fell asleep on the couch, but James and Caroline maintained their vigil. It was nearly midnight when they heard the pounding on the door. Caroline flew to open it and found Yates and Miguel, both coated in ice, Miguel leaning heavily on Yates's shoulder. "Get them inside," Caroline ordered James, already moving to help. They got both men to the fire, stripping off frozen outer layers, wrapping them in blankets. Miguel had frostbite on his fingers, and Yates's face was raw from wind exposure, but both were alive. "We found a box canyon and sheltered there," Yates explained through chattering teeth. "Could not see our hands in front of our faces to find home sooner." "The cattle?" James asked. "Bunched up in the lee of the North Ridge," Miguel replied. "They will be all right if the storm does not last too long." Caroline brought them hot soup, the same beef and vegetable recipe Yates had first fed her all those years ago, and watched as they ate, color slowly returning to their faces. Only when she was satisfied they were truly all right did she allow herself to cry, tears of relief streaming down her face. Yates set aside his bowl and gathered her into his arms. "I am sorry I frightened you." "Do not ever do that again," Caroline said fiercely against his chest. "I cannot lose you, I will not." "You will not," Yates promised. "I will always find my way back to you." The blizzard passed, and they lost only 5 head of cattle, a miracle given the severity of the storm. But it served as a reminder that the land was still wild, still dangerous, and could not be taken for granted. When James turned 18, he told his parents he wanted to stay on the ranch rather than seek his fortune elsewhere. Yates clapped his son on the shoulder, pride shining in his eyes, while Caroline cried happy tears. Sarah, at 13, announced she intended to become a teacher, and they supported that dream too, though it meant she would have to go to Santa Fe for training. The ranch that Yates and Caroline had built with nothing but determination and love had grown into a thriving operation. They now ran 300 head of cattle, employed 4 full-time hands, and had earned a reputation for raising quality stock. Their brand, a linked C and Y, was recognized throughout the territory. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Caroline with a trip to Denver, their first real vacation since they had married. They stayed in a proper hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, and spent 3 glorious days being ordinary people rather than ranchers. On their last night, Yates presented Caroline with a gift, a delicate silver locket with their wedding date engraved inside. "I know I did not have much to give you when we married," Yates said as he fastened it around her neck, "but I wanted you to have something beautiful, something that represents what you mean to me." Caroline touched the locket, tears in her eyes. "You gave me everything that mattered. You gave me a home, a family, a life I never dreamed possible. This is beautiful, but you are the real gift." They made love that night with the passion of newlyweds and the tenderness of old lovers, and Caroline thought about the impossible journey that had brought them to this moment. From a dying woman in the snow to this, a life so full it sometimes seemed her heart could not contain it all. The years marched on. James married a local rancher's daughter named Emma, and they had their first child, a boy they named Yates in honor of his grandfather. Sarah became a teacher in Red River, returning home from Santa Fe with a head full of ideas and a determination to give the town's children the education they deserved. She eventually married the new doctor who came to town, a quiet man from Philadelphia who loved her fierce intelligence and kind heart. Yates and Caroline became grandparents 4 times over, their house filled with the noise and chaos of family gatherings. They handed over more of the ranch operations to James, trusting him to carry on what they had built, and allowed themselves to slow down slightly, to enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. On a warm summer evening in 1912, 30 years after that winter day when Caroline had collapsed in the snow, Yates and Caroline sat on their porch watching the sunset. They were in their 50s now, both showing the marks of a life lived hard but well. Yates with silver in his hair and lines around his eyes, Caroline with capable hands roughened by work, and a few strands of white in her auburn hair. "I got a letter from the territorial governor today," Yates said, pulling the envelope from his pocket. "They want to recognize us at the Cattlemen's Association meeting, something about pioneering contribution to the industry." "That sounds very official," Caroline said, amused. "What did you tell them?" "That I would think about it," Yates replied. "I am not much for speeches and ceremonies." "You should do it," Caroline urged. "Not for yourself but for James and the grandchildren, so they know what you built here, what we built together." Yates pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the land they had worked and loved for so long. In the distance, they could see James and Miguel bringing in the horses for the night, hear the lowing of cattle settling for the evening, smell the sweet scent of the hay meadow they had planted. "You remember the soup?" Caroline asked suddenly. Yates laughed. "How could I forget? You made that sound like it was the finest meal you had ever eaten." "It was," Caroline said seriously, "because it came with kindness and safety and the promise of something more. You saved my life that day, Yates." "You saved mine too," Yates countered. "I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build something lasting." "We saved each other then," Caroline said, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "And we keep saving each other every day." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Yates Harlow and Caroline Bennett Harlow held each other close and counted their blessings. They had weathered blizzards and drought, loss and hardship, and had emerged stronger for it. They had built a legacy that would outlast them, a testament to what 2 people could accomplish with love and determination. But more than the ranch, more than the cattle or the land or the prosperity they had achieved, they had each other. From that first bowl of soup to this moment, 3 decades later, They had never left each other's side, and they never would, for as long as breath remained in their bodies. The winter wind that had nearly killed Caroline Bennett had instead been the force that brought her to Yates Harlow, and from that desperate, frozen moment had grown a love story for the ages. It was a love built on kindness in the face of hardship, on choosing each other every single day, on the understanding that the greatest adventures often begin in the darkest moments. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Yates and Caroline finally rose and went inside, his arm around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, but tonight they were simply two people who had found each other against all odds and had built a life worth living. Their story, born in hunger and winter wind, had become a testament to the enduring power of love, the strength of partnership, and the beautiful truth that sometimes the very thing that threatens to destroy us can lead us to exactly where we need to be. In the wild west town of Red River, New Mexico, where winters were harsh and survival was never guaranteed, Yates and Caroline had not just survived, they had thrived, creating a legacy that would echo through generations. And when they finally lay down to sleep that night, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for 30 years, both offered silent thanks for the winter wind, the hunger, the chance encounter that had changed everything. For in the end, the cowboy had fed her soup and never left her side, and the woman who had nearly died had found in him not just a savior, but a partner, a lover, a home. Their grandchildren would grow up hearing the story of how Grandma Caroline had fainted from hunger in the winter wind, and how Grandpa Yates had rescued her, fed her soup, and stayed by her side. They would hear how love could bloom even in the harshest conditions, how two people with nothing but determination and each other could build an empire. They would learn that the greatest riches had nothing to do with money or land, but everything to do with finding the right person to walk beside you through life's journey. And that story, passed down through the years, would remind each generation that miracles could happen in the unlikeliest moments, that kindness was never wasted, and that true love, the kind that lasted a lifetime, was worth any hardship, any struggle, any challenge. The Harlow Ranch continued to prosper long after Yates and Caroline were gone, but their true legacy was not measured in acres or cattle. It was measured in the love they had shared, the family they had built, and the example they had set. They had shown that the Wild West, for all its harshness, could also be a place of tenderness, that cowboys could be gentle, and that a woman who had lost everything could find not just survival, but true happiness. In Red River, New Mexico, where the winters were still harsh and the wind still howled through the mountains, the story of Yates and Caroline became legend. It was a reminder that love could conquer hunger, cold, and despair. That one act of kindness could change the course of two lives. That staying by someone's side through their darkest hour could lead to a lifetime of light. And so, as the 20th century marched forward and the Wild West became history, the love story of the cowboy and the woman he saved remained alive, a beacon of hope and proof that happily ever after was not just a fairy tale, but something that could be built with strong hands, brave hearts, and unwavering devotion.